All right, so we are now recording. Welcome to those of you who attended. We got kind of a record attendance tonight. There's 4 of you. And my plan is to first do the presentation about critically appraising evidence. And I'm thinking that may take an hour, and then we'll take a short break. And then my plan is to go through a presentation about source use and source citation. And the reason for that presentation relates to the issues I encountered when grading the problem introduction assignments. And I'll explain more about that when we get to it. And I'm thinking that's going to take probably an hour, maybe an hour and a half. And we will take a break because I'm finding that I need to keep the recordings short, or I can't, they become too large and I can't upload them. And then with what remaining time we have left, we'll do questions. I'll do a overview of Module 3 and Module Appraisal Assignment Preview. Okay, so with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the critically appraising evidence presentation. Okay, so we're moving forward in the process of evidence-based practice to appraising the evidence, and you found out through the reading that you have to do that. It's a necessary step to being able to synthesize the evidence, which is the necessary step before you're able to use that evidence in practice. Okay. So one of the objectives for this module was that you differentiate practice-based evidence from research evidence and evidence-based practice. And so I just sort of put together this table here that compares the major features of each of those things. And some of you would have been assigned to address this objective in the module 3.1 discussion, and you'll get a chance to address one of the other major objectives in your reply to one of the students who had to respond to the other major prompt for that discussion. So basically, practice-based evidence is just another word for internal evidence, and that should be a term that you're familiar with from previous modules. And we know that internal evidence includes quality improvement, evidence, quality indicators, such as fall rates for an organization, infection rates, et cetera, and patient satisfaction data. And there could be other types of internal evidence that constitutes practice-based evidence as well. The purpose of practice-based evidence is for organizational use. So organizations can improve, they can monitor and improve the quality of the care they deliver. It also informs PICO questions. It gives you ideas about problems within the organization that need to be addressed through evidence-based practice. And it also can lead to, or internal evidence can also be used to evaluate evidence-based practice and quality improvement initiatives. Okay, so usually organizations do not publish their practice-based or internal evidence in journals. They might do that if they actually did a formal quality improvement or evidence-based practice project. They might go ahead and publish that in a journal, but typically that evidence is generated strictly for internal organizational use. And it doesn't, it isn't generalizable knowledge, meaning that you can't take that knowledge from a specific organization or setting and apply it directly in other settings, because other settings are going to be different in terms of their characteristics and their problems. Now, research evidence is external evidence, and it can come in the form of systematic reviews, single reports of single studies. It could also include EBPQI reports, evidence-based guidelines, and expert opinion. So those are, those are types of external evidence. Research evidence is going to be comprised of the first two, systematic reviews and reports of single studies, whereas these other types of evidence listed here are actually based on research evidence, evidence-based guidelines and evidence-based practice, quality improvement projects and reports. An expert opinion is often somewhat research evidence-based, but it could also just be based on the expert's personal, professional experience. Research evidence is intended to generate new knowledge. Okay, so it answers questions about things that we do not know. It's often published in journals, and if designed correctly, the study would result in evidence or knowledge that's generalizable beyond the settings where the study took place. The evidence-based practice then is basically a process that involves using external evidence to solve practice problems. And it can involve also use of practice-based evidence to define the problem and to evaluate the outcomes of evidence-based practice change. Its purpose is basically to improve care and to improve outcomes and to achieve best practices. And as I was mentioning before when I was discussing practice-based evidence, evidence-based practice, if initiated formally within an organization, it may be written up and submitted to a journal as a report for publication. But the knowledge that's generated from evidence-based practice initiatives is not generally considered generalizable knowledge. Okay, so then the relationships of evidence-based or levels of evidence to quality, quantity, and consistency of evidence was another objective. It was objective 2, which was to explain the relationship of levels of evidence to quality, quantity, and consistency of evidence. So if you were in the first half of the alphabet with your last name, then you would have answered the previous discussion prompt, but if you were in the second half of the alphabet, then you would have answered this discussion prompt. So the overall strength of a body of evidence is going to depend in part on the level of evidence provided by each source of the body, source of evidence that the body contains. So the strength of research evidence should be graded according to the quality, quantity, and consistency of the evidence. And that's a recommendation by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, as cited by Finout, Overholt, and Stevens. Okay, and then this just illustrates the relationship of levels of evidence to quality, quantity, and consistency of evidence. The level is determined by looking at an evidence hierarchy, and we'll look at one of those in a little bit. And you know that there's different evidence hierarchies depending on the type of PICO question that you ask. So different types of evidence can have a different level depending on the type of PICO question that's being posed. Then the quantity of evidence refers to the number of sources of evidence that answer the PICO question. So regarding research evidence, the quantity of evidence is also evaluated based on the number of study participants and how effective the treatment was. So quantity refers to several things when you're looking at the relationship of levels of evidence to quality, quantity, and consistency of evidence. Now, consistency relates to the findings across studies or across sources of evidence and the extent to which different researchers doing different studies produce the same or similar findings. Okay. Oh, and I think I skipped over quality. It's basically related to how the research or how the study was done, the rigor of the methods that were used, and the controls that were put in place to prevent bias to the study findings. Okay, now this slide relates to objective 4, which is to identify appropriate research designs for answering different types of clinical questions, such as intervention, diagnostic, prognostic, or meaning PICO questions. And also, let's see, basically, and you can find this slide in chapter 2 of your book. You can see on the left-hand column the types of PICO questions are listed: intervention, diagnostic or diagnosis, then prognosis, prediction, etiology, and meaning. And then adjacent to those different types of PICO questions are the levels of evidence that you might use or might find to answer that type of PICO question. So you can see for intervention PICO questions, the evidence hierarchy is the largest for that type of question. And we have systematic reviews and meta-analyses at the top. Those happen to be systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. And then it moves, actually the numbers go up, but the level of evidence that's provided actually decreases as you move down through these types of evidence, with expert opinion being at the bottom of the pyramid or the hierarchy. And then you can see that you've got a little bit different hierarchies if you're posing a prognosis, prediction, or an etiology PICO question. And then the same thing for a meaning PICO question. Your hierarchy is going to vary according to the type of question that you're asking. And for the most part, students in the MSN program go on to do projects that involve some type of a practice change that would be considered an intervention change. And so the PICO questions are often intervention PICO questions. Occasionally they might be a diagnosis or diagnostic question, but rarely have I seen students pose prognosis, prediction, or etiology and meaning questions. And for the most part, the graduate project is designed to promote intervention PICO questions. And so you're going to be looking at evidence in this 7-level hierarchy. It includes some other types of evidence that aren't included here, as you will see from the rapid critical appraisal forms that are available that we're going to talk about later on. I made this chart, and it's sort of a work in progress because I'm waiting on some feedback from the authors of the textbook regarding a couple things. These items that are highlighted in yellow, I'm not really sure that that's the level of evidence they provide given the particular PICO question that's asked. But this, I just made this as a tool for people to kind of decide which level of evidence a source is going to provide depending on the type of PICO question. And those are listed across the middle section here. And then the rapid critical appraisal form you would use to actually evaluate or appraise the particular source. So you'll see if you look across here, systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials with or without meta-analysis are going to provide level 1 evidence for an intervention or diagnostic PICO question. They're not applicable for prognosis, prediction, or etiology questions or meaning questions. And there is a specific form that you would use to do the rapid critical appraisal of a source that happens to be a systematic review of randomized controlled trials. So there's a specific form for that. And then you move down to reports of single randomized controlled trials. Those are going to provide level 2 evidence to answer an intervention or diagnostic PICO question. They're not applicable for prognosis, etiology, or meaning questions. And then there's a specific rapid critical appraisal form for randomized controlled trials. And then moving on down the hierarchy, you can see that the rigor of the studies or the rigor of the work decreases. If you consider a randomized controlled trial to be the most rigorous type of study to address, to test the effectiveness of an intervention, as you move down here, you'll see we go from single controlled trials without randomization, and then you go to systematic review of cohort or case control studies. Actually, those are not applicable for intervention PICO questions, but they are applicable for a prognosis, prediction, or etiology question. But basically, if you're looking down this, if there's a level of evidence assigned under the intervention or diagnostic type PICO question, then you'll know that type of evidence listed in this column is applicable for answering that particular type of PICO question. If there's an asterisk there, it means the level of or the type of source listed in this column is not applicable for that type of PICO question. Okay. And this is, you could pretty much all the types of publications you would find would probably be classified as one of these types listed in this column. And then you can see the lowest or least strong level of evidence is level 7 for an intervention or diagnostic PICO question, whereas it's level 5 for a prognosis, prognostic, prediction, etiology, and meaning question. Okay, and so you'll find this form in the file in, I believe, module 3.1 in the file that has the critical appraisal tools in it. Okay. So regarding the level of evidence that is provided by an evidence source, it's going to require some skill on your part, some skill that you hopefully came with to the course and are able to hone or develop as you move through this course. So some of the things that you need to be able to do is you need to be able to differentiate research evidence from non-research evidence. So when you pick up a journal article and you're trying to determine what level of evidence it provides, the first thing you're going to have to do is determine whether it's a report of a study, a systematic review, or if it's some form of non-research evidence. You need to be able to recognize the features of the research design if you decide that it is research evidence or a report of a study. And then you also need to be able to recognize the features of non-research evidence. Okay, now doing or applying these skills is facilitated by using the general appraisal overview form, the evidence determination worksheet, and the rapid critical appraisal forms. And those are all things that you're going to be practicing using in the next major assignment that's coming up in a few weeks, the evidence appraisal assignment. Okay, so the general appraisal overview form is your first step in the critical appraisal process. It could be considered a repository for information from a source. You are reading the source and you're pulling out information and recording it on this form. So it's used to extract information from a source. And the term for that is to abstract the source. Doing this facilitates your familiarity with the source. And the idea is that you want to collect all the relevant information from a source to minimize the number of times that you have to go back to that source to look things up again. Okay, so you want to make this a sort of like a bucket for all the information that you're going to pull out of that source. And the idea is the more thoroughly you fill out the general appraisal overview, the less likely you're going to have to be to spend time going back to the source to check facts and to check information in the source. Now, one thing I want to point out right away is that, just so you don't get confused about some terminology here, is that extracting information from the body of the source, or a body of the evidence in the source, it's abstract. Okay, so you want to get information from the actual article of the source, not its abstract. Okay, and this is called abstracting, but that does not mean you should extract information from the abstract. Okay, so it's a good idea to always read the abstract of a source. In fact, it's necessary during the screening process when you've done your literature search. It's necessary to identify the potential keepers. You need to read the abstract. And if the abstract isn't available, then you often have to request the full text of the source so that you can screen it. But once you have the full source and you've determined, that it's a keeper or a potential keeper, then you have to read the full article. And it's the full article that you want to extract information from. So the abstracting process is applied to the full article. All right, so when I'm looking at your evidence appraisal forms and any other forms or work that you might do in this class, I want to see that you have paraphrased or quoted information from the full article, not its abstract. And let me know if you have questions about what I mean. Okay, so the next thing I want to look at here is the general appraisal overview form. And you'll notice that there's one provided by your textbook, but the textbook has it tends to be oriented towards the stricter definition of evidence, which is sort of restricted to research evidence. Even though they say, you know, there are some forms of or sources of non-research evidence that can still be used to answer a PICO question, all the tools and forms seem to be oriented towards research evidence. And so this form has been modified slightly just to accommodate information that you might get from an expert opinion piece or a non-research literature review that you might locate to include in your body of evidence to answer your PICO question. We've also added extra pages to this form for attaching your evidence determination worksheet and the rapid critical appraisal form for a source. And I'll just point out that this form is always evolving because we're sort of improving it as we go along and trying to make it work the best for the students in our program. So when you get to Evidence-Based Practice 2 in NU536, you might have a slightly different version of this form. So just keep that in mind. For example, last semester, this information down here at the bottom of the form, the evidence level based on the evidence determination worksheet, that actually appeared at the very top above the reference list entry piece of the form. Okay. All right, so now I'm just going to go through the sections of the form and discuss what the information that you want to extract from the source to put in this form. So what I've written in red is just sort of like instructions for what we expect you to write in each section of the general appraisal overview. And I've made an effort to make sure that what I've written in these sections is a direct reflection of what you will find on the evaluation table template that's going to come up in a future module. I'm not sure if it's the next module or the one after. It's probably in the module 4 when we go into synthesizing evidence. In that module, you'll be building an evaluation table, which is essentially a review matrix where you you'll have each source that's in your body of evidence listed. There'll be a row for each source in that table, and then the column headings will pertain to information that you're going to have abstracted from the sources and put on this general appraisal overview form. So they're related in that way. So looking at the form, full reference list entry is actually fairly self-explanatory. You want to type the full reference list entry for the source. So, I don't know if I said this, but you're going to have one general appraisal overview form for each source of evidence that answers your PICO question. Okay, so one of these forms per source. And we want you to type the reference list entry accurately in using APA format in this section, because that makes it easy to copy and paste it into a reference list and to other places where you might need to do that. Okay, so then the second box, you're going to put the PICO question. So type your PICO question and then mark the elements in parentheses like it's shown in the textbook. And then specify the question type. Is it an intervention, diagnostic, prognostic, or meaning PICO question? And the reason that we specify that you state what the PICO question type is because sometimes it's hard to differentiate an intervention question from a diagnostic or prognostic question, at least in my experience. So that's why we want you to specify the type so that we know what your intentions are. Okay, then the next section, and you're going to find that most of these sections seem very oriented towards a report of a study or a systematic review, and that's just sort of the nature of the evidence-based practice process, because you always want to use the best available evidence, and you hope that there's research evidence available to answer your PICO question, because that's going to provide you with the best available evidence. So regarding the purpose of the work that's reported in the source, you want to describe that purpose and just consider, why was it done? Why was the study done? Why was the project done? And then I recommend that you accurately quote or paraphrase from the source what the purpose statement was. And typically in a research report, there's always going to be a statement of purpose somewhere near the end of the problem introduction, right before the methods section. Sometimes you'll see it at the end of the literature review. But typically you're going to see the purpose statement right before the methodology section. And you can either quote or paraphrase that. So there's not going to be a whole lot of information in this section here. Next is the theoretical or conceptual framework. And we note that if applicable, because often you'll see reports of research that do not have a theoretical or conceptual framework. And that doesn't mean that they aren't based on a theoretical or conceptual framework. It just means that the authors did not include a description of that framework in the publication. So if they don't state what it is, you don't have to speculate on what the framework is. You can just simply say that, or you can just simply write that it was not stated or was not identified. So don't speculate or make it up. And then design, if applicable, and that's the design is always going to be applicable for a report of a study. And you won't always see a section in a research report called design. Sometimes you will, but often the design is described in the methods or methodology section. Okay, and also include mention of human subjects protection. Okay, at a minimum, most reports of studies are going to mention that the study was approved or reviewed by an institutional review board or a human subjects committee or an ethics committee. So you just want to mention that that happened, because that lends to the credibility of the study if it was approved, and you can then be confident that human subjects were not mistreated in that study. So all reports of research are going to contain a description of the study design. They may not specifically state what the design is. In other words, they may not say this was an experimental design, or this was a randomized controlled trial, or this was a quasi-experimental design. They may not say that, and so you may have to determine based on how the study procedures were described, and then come up with your determination on what type of design it was. But in any case, in addition to identifying the study design, you want to sort of describe how they did it. You know, did they divide subjects into two groups and then give a treatment to one group and not to the other, and then compare outcomes on the two groups? So those things will all inform your decision about what type of design the researchers stated the study was. And you'll notice there's different terms for the same type of design. So, for example, a randomized controlled trial is conducted using an experimental design, whereas a controlled trial might not be randomized. In other words, it might be a quasi-experimental study. So those things you need to be cognizant of. And I would be prepared, if I were you, to dig up your nursing research textbook from undergrad, or to check one out in the library so that you can review research designs. Now, the textbook for this course does review research designs quite a bit, and to some extent they really go overboard with some of the statistical information that you will find in those when those types of designs are used. But the expectation here is that you be able to determine and classify the type of design, even if the researchers or the authors do not explicitly label it as a particular type of design. Okay. So then the next part of the forum, the research questions, hypotheses, or study aims. Reports of research are typically going to include either research questions or hypotheses. Sometimes they might have both, and sometimes they might also have specific study aims or objectives. You can just, you either need to accurately paraphrase or quote these from the report. Okay. If they aren't, if they aren't stated, don't make them up necessarily unless you are transparent about the fact that you're speculating on what those might be. And sometimes you can tell if, sorry, I'm getting trigger happy here. Often you can tell from the purpose statement what the unstated research questions, hypotheses, or specific aims were. But just be clear about whether you're guessing or not if they aren't stated. Because when I review your evidence appraisal forms or your general appraisal overview forms, I'm going to be comparing what you wrote to what I see in the actual source that you were abstracting, because I want to make sure you understand the information that you're reading in the source. And if I don't find any research questions, hypotheses, or specific aims stated, but you've got them stated in this section, then I'm going to wonder if we were reading the same article, or if you misunderstood, or if you're speculating. So just kind of anticipate that and be clear. Think about your reader. And then the next section, the sampling method, sample size, and characteristics. This is just going to be applicable to reports of research. So you may not have anything written in here if the source is not a report of a study. If it's a report of a systematic review, then the sampling method refers to how the authors went about finding and selecting the studies that were included in the review, the number of studies that were included, and the inclusion-exclusion criteria would specify the characteristics. But for a report of a single study, how did the researchers create the sample from which they collected data? Did they use a random sampling method, or did they study a sample of people who were conveniently available to them? So this section is going to require you to think back to your undergraduate research course and the types of sampling designs that are used. And the two major categories are probability sampling and non-probability sampling. And most studies do not use probability sampling because that requires that you have access to like the entire population, and that you can take a sample of participants from that population. But in most cases, researchers don't have access to an entire population, so they have to study people who are conveniently available to them. So be looking for the researchers' descriptions of their sampling method and summarize how they did that. And then you can make the determination whether they use some type of probability or non-probability sampling. Include the sample size and also mention the characteristics. And by characteristics, I mean like demographic characteristics, the number of males, females, the age range, the racial or ethnic composition of the sample. And you'll be able to see, usually the researchers will summarize in a table the characteristics of the sample so that you know who the people were that were studied. And that also allows you to make some decisions about the generalizability of the findings, because if the sample is very homogeneous, meaning they're all mostly white, mostly female, then the generalizability to other populations with more diverse composition is compromised if your sample is quite homogeneous. Okay, major study variables then. Generally with an intervention study, you're thinking of independent and dependent variables. With cohort or case series, cohort studies, you're thinking of predictor and outcome variables. So you have to kind of think about that carefully when you're reviewing the study methodology and identifying the major study variables. And you don't have to include every single variable in this section. Mainly you want to include the variables that relate directly to your PICO question. So if it's an intervention study, then you should identify the independent and dependent variables. And I'll tell you that reports of research won't necessarily do that for you. Generally, the independent variable is the grouping variable. It's the way that researchers decided to divide subjects into groups so that they could compare them. So for example, a treatment for, let's say, coronavirus. Let's say we've got a new vaccine to prevent coronavirus, and we randomize subjects into a group that's going to receive the vaccine, and then the other subjects or participants go into a group that's not going to receive the vaccine. And then we observe those people to see who actually developed the virus and compare the proportions to determine if our vaccine was effective or not. So that would, the way that subjects are grouped for comparison would be your independent variable, whereas the dependent variable is going to be your outcome, like development of the condition coronavirus or not developing it. Okay. And by the same token, you might, if you were looking at a predictive or prognostic type study, let's say, we followed a bunch of people for several weeks who had traveled abroad to see which ones would actually develop coronavirus. And so in that case, the predictor variable would be having traveled abroad, whereas the outcome variable would be the development of the condition or the disease. And then also in this section, you want to write down how the variables were measured. Okay, what instruments were used to measure the variables. If the dependent variable is blood pressure, then you would, specify the type of blood pressure cuff that was used to assess blood pressure. If the dependent variable was a disease, then you would specify how that disease was diagnosed. That would be your measure of that particular variable. And then you also want to include in this section the information about the validity and reliability of the measurements that were provided. Any information about that. For example, studies that use psychometric instruments, like to measure things like depression or anxiety, the researchers should always include information about the development of those instruments and the extent to which their validity and reliability were studied and tested. Okay, and the last section on this slide is data analyses. Again, going to apply primarily to reports of research. So what you're going to be including in this section is the statistical tests that were used to answer the PICO question. You don't need to include every statistic, just the ones that were used to analyze the variables that answer your PICO question. And then for qualitative evidence, you're going to describe the data analysis technique that was used to produce the evidence that relates to your PICO question. So often in qualitative studies, they do some type of content analysis where they analyze the narrative responses of individuals, and they categorize, or they identify themes, and they create categories of responses. So that's what you include there. Now, you don't want to put any results here. You just want to put the tests or the analysis techniques that were used. Okay, and then the last section of the form, you're going to include the study findings or conclusions, if applicable, or if it's not research, whatever evidence that source provides that somehow relates to your PICO question. I'll just tell you right now, you'll have a lot easier time in this course using the tools that are provided if you are working with a report of a research or a systematic review. All the forms are just simply geared that way. And also if you're working with a quantitative research report, not a qualitative one. And I'm not saying that you should absolutely go that direction, because depending on your PICO question, qualitative evidence might provide the best answer. But I'm just saying that for the purposes of this course and to get used to using the tools, you might want to work with quantitative evidence. Okay, so you should ask yourself, what were the results of the analyses that were run to answer research questions or test hypotheses that relate to your PICO question. And you want to provide the statistical result, the p-value, and hopefully the researchers reported a confidence interval or some other interval, some other comparable measure, maybe an odds ratio or something like that, and maybe effect size values as well. So you should include that information here. And then for each statistical test that you've listed in the previous section, there should be a result listed in this section. Okay, now for qualitative evidence, you would ask yourself, what were the narrative findings that relate to your PICO question? What conclusions are warranted by the study findings? And that's actually applies, this last item here, what conclusions are warranted by the study findings, actually applies to both quantitative and qualitative evidence. And it refers to your conclusions, not the researchers, because the researchers will state conclusions about their study findings, and those are typically stated in the discussion section of a research report. But you need to be thinking, okay, here are the results of the analyses. What conclusions are warranted based on the analyses? So if the researchers, for example, did not find a statistically significant effect of the vaccination for the COVID-19 virus, then you would not be warranted in concluding that the COVID-19 virus vaccine is effective, because they would have to find that there would be a statistically significant difference in the development of the virus by people who got the vaccine compared to those who did not. So if the researchers found that there were similar prevalences or similar instances of the virus occurring in people who did and who did not get the vaccine, then we couldn't conclude that the vaccine was effective. Okay, so if you see a conclusion like that when there's no statistically significant findings or differences between groups, then you'd be questioning the researchers' conclusions, and your own conclusions then would be that the intervention was not effective or the treatment was not effective. Okay, then the next section, strengths and limitations. These are also should be things that you identify. You can list here. Researchers always in the discussion section of a research report will list their study limitations. Sometimes they don't list every limitation that they should list. And so you should be thinking about the other limitations of the study that you should list. And typically the strengths that researchers won't often list strengths of their study. So you will have to glean those for yourself. And typically those relate to the type of design that was used, the extent to which extraneous or confounding variables were controlled. And then limitations are often, the most typical limitation is going to be small sample size. And small sample size is going to impair generalizability of study findings. But another limitation would be like if researchers used a non-randomized design to test an intervention instead of a randomized design, because then you have the bias of potentially there being something different about the participants in the group that got a treatment compared to the participants in the group that did not get the treatment, such that that difference would account for why the treatment was or was not effective rather than the treatment itself. So that's where study design could be a limitation. And then the last section, you're going to, depending on what your PICO question type is, you will check one of these levels of evidence to classify the particular source that you abstracted onto the general appraisal overview as providing a particular level of evidence. Okay. Now, even though the source by virtue of its design, or the study by virtue of its design will provide a certain level of evidence, it could be a poorly done study. There could be lots of issues that would cause you to give it a lower assignment of evidence level. Okay, so if you're working with an intervention or diagnostic PICO question, you're going to check one of these boxes, or I should say brackets. If you're working with a prognosis or prediction PICO question, your check mark's going to appear in the middle row. And if you're working with a meaning PICO question, your check mark's going to occur in the third row. So you're not going to check something in each row. You're going to just check one row depending on what your PICO question is. All right. Any questions so far? Oh, I see some people have been posting some questions. So let's see. Is expert, let me get back up here. That was comedy. Okay. Mary asked, is expert opinion the most biased of RE being research evidence? And technically, expert opinion is not even research evidence. So that my table is a bit confusing in that regard. So I probably should fix that table to take that out of there. But research evidence is only going to be provided by systematic reviews and reports of single studies. Okay, so expert opinion is not a type of research evidence. It might be somewhat based on research evidence in addition to the expert's professional experience. But it's not even a study, so you don't even consider bias. Actually, you could. It's going to be extremely biased towards the expert's thinking or the expert's opinions. Okay, and then Amber asks, how many sources are we going to have to appraise for this next project? I think the evidence appraisal assignment is just 2 sources. Okay, so you're going to fill out a general appraisal overview form, an evidence determination worksheet, and a rapid critical appraisal form for 2 sources. Okay, so you'll actually be completing 6 forms, 3 for each source. Okay, any other questions? All right, if not, I will keep moving ahead here. Oh, I did forget about the last section of the form. There's a place for notes, a place on the general appraisal overview where you can write down anything that you think is pertinent about the source that maybe wasn't captured or didn't seem to fit in any of the other sections on the source. Okay. And then the last thing is just I've credited the general appraisal overview form in the textbook as being the source from which this particular general appraisal overview form was adapted. Okay, now I've mentioned rapid critical appraisal forms a couple of times, and these relate to Objective 6, which is to complete the appropriate rapid critical appraisal form for an evidence source and complete it accurately. There's going to be a rapid critical appraisal form for each type of evidence that you might find to answer your PICO question. Okay, so, and you're going to, there's 3 main criteria by which you're going to appraise quantitative evidence based on how you've completed the rapid critical appraisal form. And that's going to be validity, reliability, and applicability. So you'll see that when you look at the rapid critical appraisal forms, with the exception of the one that's intended for qualitative studies, you'll see that these forms typically are subdivided into sections on validity, reliability, and applicability. Okay, so in this case, I want to make sure that you know the difference between the validity and reliability of instruments or measures and the validity and reliability of a source that you're rapidly critically appraising. Okay, so they're different. In terms of completing the rapid critical appraisal form, validity is going to refer to the study methods. How sound were the methods, and what is the extent to which the findings from the study can be generalized beyond the sample or the setting where the study was conducted. And then reliability refers to the dependability or trustworthiness. Or I'm sorry, I'm kind of mixing my qualitative and quantitative metaphors there. It refers to the dependability of the results. Can the study findings be depended on to have the desired impact in practice? And to a large extent, reliability is going to refer to the results of the statistical analyses reported in the journal article. And then applicability, you would ask yourself, are the study findings relevant and applicable to the population in my PICO question? Okay, and or in other words, to the population in the setting where you would propose to do an evidence-based practice quality improvement project to address the PICO question that you're interested in. So in other words, does the P in the PICO question equal the P or the population that was studied in the journal article that you've read? Okay, and then the appraisal criteria for qualitative evidence is similar to the appraisal criteria for the quantitative evidence, that it's different terminology is used, and you'll recognize this terminology in qualitative studies that you read. So credibility refers to this, again, the soundness of the methods that were used to do the qualitative study. You would ask yourself, are the findings an accurate representation of the data? It to some extent then refers to the validity of the evidence. Is it valid? Is it believable? And then transferability refers to whether or not the findings are meaningful to people in similar circumstances. So in some, to some extent, its transferability is like generalizability or the external validity of findings in a quantitative study. And then dependability refers to the reliability of the results. Are the methods sufficiently reported so that you can determine how the data were analyzed and how conclusions were derived? And could those findings be replicated given the same or similar circumstances at some other point in time? And then lastly, for qualitative evidence appraisal, you consider confirmability, and that refers to whether the findings stem from the data. Can you backtrack from the conclusions to the study findings? All right, in order to, like, say, corroborate them or verify those findings. Okay, and with that, I just have references, and we will go back to see if you have any questions. Okay, so Alicia asked a question. Want to clarify the research evidence in a quantitative study has a control group versus a non-research evidence doesn't have control group. I'm not, let's see, that's not quite, okay, so a control group is only applicable to research evidence. It's only applicable to a particular type of study design, and that's like a controlled trial, okay, where you have a control group that does not get an intervention or gets some sort of an alternative intervention versus an experimental or a treatment group that actually gets an intervention or a treatment. Okay, if it's non-research evidence, then the terms treatment, experimental, control group, and comparison group are not applicable. Okay, so you're not going to see that sort of thing in reports of quality improvement, evidence-based practice initiatives, or you're not going to see it in reports of qualitative studies or any expert opinion pieces. Does that make sense? So those are terms that only apply to research evidence. Yeah. So I guess just in some respects, you're right. Non-research evidence does not have a control group. In fact, it's just not even something you consider because it's not applicable. All right. Any other questions? And if not, we will take a 10-minute break. Actually, we'll just make it till 5:15. because we're at 5:04 right now. And so I will stop recording and restart the recording when we come back and restart at 5:15. In the meantime, feel free to post questions in the chat and I'll take a look at those right away when we come back from break. All right.